The attic was sweltering, and the heat pressed down on me like a weight. Dust swirled in golden streaks of sunlight coming through the cracked window, catching in my throat as I brushed a cobweb from my sleeve. I muttered under my breath, annoyed at myself for not tackling this sooner. Years of clutter and I'd let it pile up. Ben had offered to hire someone to deal with it, but I'd refused. This was my house, my memories. No stranger was going to go through my things. I had already sorted through a stack of boxes, mostly labeled with familiar terms: Christmas, books, kitchenware. Then I came across one I didn't recognize. The label was different, the handwriting uneven and almost childlike. Memories. I knelt down, brushing my fingers over the word. The box was light when I lifted it, the lid slipping free easily. Inside was a jumble of items: Polaroids, a pair of tiny ballet slippers, and a few ribbons. My heart gave a small pang at the sight of the slippers. I hadn't danced since I was a child. Beneath the other items, something wrapped in tissue paper caught my eye. I reached for it, unwrapping it carefully. It was a diary. My diary. My breath caught as I ran my fingers over the leather cover, worn smooth from years of use. I'd thought it was lost ages ago, misplaced in one of our moves. How did you end up here? I murmured to it, as if it might answer. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, flipping it open. The pages were yellowed, but my handwriting was still clear. Dear Diary, the first page read. A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. I'd been so earnest as a child, pouring my thoughts into these pages. As I read, memories came flooding back. Begging Dad to build me a treehouse, dreaming of running away to the beach, sobbing after a ruined recital. It felt like stepping into a time capsule. And then I saw it, writing in the margins. Words that weren't mine. I blinked, leaning closer. The handwriting was unfamiliar but deliberate, trailing alongside my entries like a shadow. You were so brave that day. He shouldn't have yelled at you. You didn't deserve it. My heart started to race. I flipped to another page. Running away would have been the wrong choice. Good thing you stayed. My stomach twisted. Who had written this? And how? The notes were scattered, appearing sporadically throughout the diary. Some were just single words: sad, beautiful, regret. Others were longer, commenting on events I'd almost forgotten. Then I reached the entry for my 10th birthday, the one my parents had nearly forgotten. I'd written, I guess I'm not that important. They didn't even get me a cake. In the margin, they were wrong to forget. You are important. You always have been. I stared at the words, my hands trembling. The handwriting was eerily familiar, and I couldn't stop myself from grabbing my phone. I scrolled through my messages until I found what I was looking for. A grocery list Ben had sent me last week. I compared the two. It was the same. No, iwisparat. This didn't make sense. The diary had been lost for years, long before I even met Ben. How could he have written in it? My hands moved on their own, flipping through page after page. Each note was like a whisper from the past, intimate and unnerving. Things I'd never told anyone, things Ben shouldn't have known. My throat tightened. I slammed the book shut and shoved it back into the box. For a moment I considered leaving it there, forgetting I'd ever seen it. But my curiosity wouldn't let me. I grabbed the diary and headed downstairs. By the time I reached the living room, my hands had stopped shaking, but my heart hadn't. I set the diary on the coffee table and stared at it. The questions buzzed in my mind, louder with every second. When I heard the sound of Ben's car pulling into the driveway, my stomach dropped. He walked in, balancing a bag of groceries in his laptop bag, his usual cheerful expression lighting up his face. Hey, he called out. They had those little pastries you like at the store. Thought we could have them after dinner. Ben, I said. My voice was tighter than I intended. He paused, frowning. What's wrong? I pointed to the diary. Explain this. His eyes followed my hand to the book. For a moment something flickered across his face. Then he smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Where'd you find that? The attic, I said. But that's not the point. These notes. I flipped it open, jabbing a finger at the margin. This is your handwriting. How could you have written in this? Ben set the bags down carefully. His expression shifted, unreadable. Finally he sighed. Amy, it's not what you think. Then what is it? I snapped. Because from where I'm sitting it looks insane. He ran a hand through his hair. Let's sit down. I can explain. Start now. Ben's words lingered in the air like a challenge. He moved to the couch, his steps slower than usual, his shoulders slumped. I stayed where I was, arms crossed tightly across my chest. My heart pounded so hard it felt like he must hear it too. You remember when we first met? He asked, his voice low. I narrowed my eyes. Of course. The gallery downtown. What does that have to do with this? That's where you think we met, he said. But it wasn't the first time I saw you. Something shifted in his voice, a mix of regret and something heavier I couldn't name. His hands fidgeted in his lap, and he refused to meet my gaze. The man I thought I knew, a man who always stood tall, calm, and unshaken, looked small. That, more than his words, sent a jolt of unease through me. What are you saying? My voice came out sharper than I intended. He exhaled deeply, pressing his palms together as if trying to steady himself. Amy, I knew who you were before that night. I'd seen you before. A long time before. I stayed silent, watching him. My head spun with questions, but I couldn't form a single one into words. I didn't plan it, he continued. I didn't even mean for you to notice me at first. But I watched you grow up. From a distance. The room felt like it tilted. What? The word escaped me like a gasp. He looked up finally, his eyes heavy with guilt. Not in a creepy way. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was just fascinated by you. You're not making sense, I snapped, stepping back. How could you watch me grow up? You're only 5 years older than me. What the hell does that even mean? I don't know how to explain it without sounding crazy, he admitted. But I swear to you, everything I've done, every choice I made, it was to protect you. Protect me from what? I could hear the rise in my own voice, a mix of anger and fear. None of this makes any sense. Start from the beginning. Ben stood and paced the room, running his hand through his hair. It started with the diary, he said finally. I found it a long time ago. My stomach dropped. You found it? What are you talking about? That diary has been missing for years. Exactly, he said, turning to face me. I found it before you lost it. For a moment I couldn't speak. The weight of his words, the implications of them, pressed against my chest like a stone. Before I lost it? My voice cracked on the last word. How? Ben, that's impossible. He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as though he was searching for the right words. Not impossible. Just hard to explain. Amy, the truth is, I've known about you for a long time. Longer than I should. The world tilted again. Every instinct told me to run, to scream, to demand answers. But I stayed rooted to the spot, my fists clenched at my sides. You've known about me? What does that even mean? Stop being cryptic and just tell me. He took a step closer, his expression softening. I'm telling you everything, because I want you to understand. But to do that, you need to hear the whole story. Please, Amy. His words hung in the air like a dare. I didn't want to give him the benefit of the doubt. Not after this, but I couldn't walk away either. Fine, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But you have exactly 5 minutes. Start talking. Ben didn't speak right away. He stood there watching me, his jaw working as if trying to shape the words that wouldn't come. I crossed my arms tighter, my impatience gnawing at what little restraint I had left. Ben, I said, my voice cutting through the silence, you're running out of time. He nodded, running his hand over his face. Okay, you're right. You deserve the truth. But it's not going to make sense. Not all of it, not at first. Try me, I shot back. I first saw you when you were a kid, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You wouldn't remember me, and I wasn't supposed to remember you. But I did. My stomach turned. That doesn't explain the diary. I found it, he said, meeting my gaze now, his voice stronger. I don't know how to say this without sounding crazy, but I came across it years before we met. It was in a place it shouldn't have been, Amy. I read it. I wasn't supposed to, but I did. And when I realized what it was, when I saw your handwriting, your thoughts, He broke off, his expression pained. I couldn't just ignore it. You're telling me you found my diary before I even knew you? Do you have any idea how insane that sounds? My voice rose, the tension in my chest threatening to snap. He nodded slowly. I know, but it's the truth. I don't expect you to believe me, but that's what happened. And I started writing in it. Because I thought you might need it. A little voice, even if you didn't know it was there. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in. The air too heavy to draw in properly. Ben, this is insane. Are you seriously telling me you stalked me through my childhood? No, he said quickly, stepping forward, hands raised as if to calm me. No, it wasn't like that. I wasn't watching you all the time. It wasn't even intentional at first. But once I started, I felt like I couldn't stop. The raw honesty in his voice made my skin crawl. I wanted to yell, to throw the diary at him and tell him to get out, but a sick part of me needed to hear more. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. Why couldn't you stop? His shoulders sagged, and for the first time he looked genuinely broken. Because I felt like I owed you something. Like I was connected to you in a way I couldn't explain. And I know how that sounds. Believe me, I do. But it's the truth. I shook my head, tears pricking my eyes. Ben, none of this makes sense. How does someone even stumble across a random diary? And why was it mine? I don't know, he said, his voice thick with frustration. I've spent years trying to figure that out. I wasn't looking for it, Amy. It just showed up. Like it was waiting for me. You're talking like this was fate or destiny or some kind of cosmic plan. I snapped. Do you even hear yourself? I do, he said softly. And if I were you, I wouldn't believe me either. But it happened, Amy. It's the truth, and I've been trying to protect you ever since. Protect me from what? My voice cracked under the weight of my own desperation. Ben hesitated, his eyes darting toward the diary on the coffee table. From the things I saw in that diary, the things you wrote about, and the things that shouldn't have been there. What things? I demanded, taking a step toward him. What are you talking about? His silence was deafening, his expression a mix of guilt and fear. Finally, he said, there were entries in the diary that you didn't write. Things about your future. The words hit me like a slap. I staggered back, shaking my head. No, that's not possible. You're lying. I'm not, he insisted, stepping closer. And I can prove it. Look at the later pages. You'll see what I mean. I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. Part of me wanted to grab the diary and rip it apart, to destroy the thing that had turned my life into a surreal nightmare. But the other part, the part that had kept me frozen in this confrontation, whispered that he might be telling the truth. I turned slowly, my hands trembling as I reached for the diary. This better not be another game, Ben, I said, my voice barely steady. Because if it is, I swear. It's not a game, he interrupted. Just read it, Amy. Please. I picked up the diary with shaking hands. The leather felt heavier now, as if it carried the weight of all the answers I wasn't ready to confront. My fingers fumbled as I flipped through the pages, past the familiar childhood memories, past the unnerving notes in the margins, until I reached the back. The last entries. What I saw made my stomach drop. The handwriting was mine, the loops and curves identical to the rest of the diary. But I didn't remember writing these entries. And they weren't about my past, they were about my future. January 12, 2022. You'll find the truth soon. Trust him even if it hurts. My heart skipped a beat. I read it again, my eyes glued to the date. That was just a week before Ben and I had met. But how could that be? I flipped to another entry. February 3, 2023. He'll save you when no one else can. Believe in him. Ben. My voice was barely a whisper. What is this? He didn't answer immediately. When I turned to look at him, his expression was solemn, as if bracing for whatever I was about to say. You see it, don't you? He asked softly. You know I'm not lying. I shook my head, refusing to accept it. This doesn't make sense. I didn't write this. I couldn't have. But it's your handwriting, isn't it? He pressed. It's you, Amy. No, I said, slamming the diary shut and shoving it away. My chest heaved and my pulse roared in my ears. No, this is a trick. You're doing this to me somehow. He stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. Amy, I swear on everything I love I'm not. I found it like this. I've been trying to figure it out ever since. Then explain it. I yelled, throwing my hands up. Explain how my diary knows things about my future. Explain why you were writing in it before we even met. I don't know. His voice cracked, the desperation in it mirroring my own. I don't know, Amy. All I know is that it's real. And that every time I wrote in it, I felt like I was helping you. Like it was my purpose. I stared at him, my mind spinning. Everything about this was wrong. It defied logic, reason, everything I understood about the world. And yet, the evidence was right in front of me, undeniable in its strangeness. I don't believe you, I said, even as the tremor in my voice betrayed me. I can't believe you. Ben's shoulders sagged, and he looked at me with an expression that tore at something deep inside me. You don't have to believe me, he said quietly, but you need to believe what's in that diary. It's trying to protect you, Amy. And so am I. I took a step back, clutching the diary to my chest like a shield. My breaths came fast and shallow, and the room seemed to spin around me. I need time, I said, the words coming out in a rush. I need to think. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Take all the time you need. But don't ignore it, Amy. Whatever's happening, it's not done yet. I turned and walked out of the room, my legs shaky beneath me. In the safety of my bedroom, I sank to the floor, clutching the diary as if it might hold me together. My mind raced with questions I couldn't begin to answer. Who was Ben, really? And what was this diary trying to tell me? That night I didn't sleep. The diary lay open on the bed beside me, its pages staring up at me like an accusation. The entries I hadn't written looped through my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. The words felt like a riddle, one I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. I turned on the bedside lamp and grabbed the diary again. Flipping back to the earlier pages, I tried to make sense of the connections. Ben's notes were scattered, written in his careful handwriting, as if he'd thought long and hard before putting pen to paper. But they didn't offer answers, just more questions. One entry caught my eye. June 18, 2005. Don't let this break you. It's not your fault. That date. I knew it. I'd written about a recital that went horribly wrong, a memory I hadn't revisited in years. My younger self had poured out every detail, the way my legs shook on stage, the way the teacher had scolded me afterward. But Ben's note wasn't just sympathetic, it was eerily specific. He shouldn't have known about that day, about how it had shattered my confidence for months. I closed the diary with a snap and got out of bed. Sitting there wasn't helping. I needed to do something, anything, to make sense of this. I tiptoed to the living room, expecting Ben to still be awake, but the house was silent. The grocery bags he brought in were still on the counter, unpacked. The sight made something twist in my chest. Despite everything, Ben wasn't acting like a man with malicious intentions. He looked scared, tired, like he'd been carrying a secret too heavy for too long. I found him in the guest room. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring down at his hands. He didn't look up when I stepped into the doorway. Why didn't you tell me before? I asked, my voice quiet. He sighed, his shoulders slumping further. Because I didn't know how. I thought, if I told you too soon you'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am. You don't sound crazy, I admitted. You sound desperate. He finally looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. I am desperate, Amy. I've been desperate since the day I found that diary. It's like I've been living someone else's life, someone else's plan. And I don't know how to stop it. What do you mean? I asked, stepping closer. He rubbed his face with both hands, exhaling sharply. I've been trying to protect you from something, but I don't even know what it is. All I know is that the diary, it keeps showing me pieces of your life. And every time I see something, I feel like I have to help. Help with what? My voice broke, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He shook his head. I don't know. I don't know if it's danger or pain or some event. But it's coming, Amy. I can feel it. The room felt colder suddenly, and I wrapped my arms around myself. Why me? Why does this diary care about me? Ben hesitated, his expression torn. I think you're connected to it. Somehow. The way it showed up in my life, the way it keeps pulling me toward you. It's not random. I stared at him, my mind a blur of fear and doubt. The logical part of me screamed to reject everything he was saying, to walk away and leave the diary behind. But the part of me that had seen those words in my handwriting, the words I hadn't written, couldn't let go. If you're right, I said, my voice trembling, then what's next? What do we do? Ben stood, his expression resolute. We figure out the diary. We figure out what it wants. And we stop whatever's coming. His words hung in the air, and for the first time I realized we were in this together whether I liked it or not. The next morning the house was steeped in an uneasy quiet. I'd slept in fits and starts, my mind running through the same questions over and over again. The diary sat on the coffee table, its leather cover catching the morning light, as if daring me to open it again. Ben was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, staring into a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. We need to start at the beginning, I said, breaking the silence. He looked up surprised. You believe me now? I don't know what I believe, I admitted, sitting across from him. But I've seen enough to know that ignoring this isn't an option. Ben nodded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw relief flicker across his face. Okay, where do you want to start? The diary, I said, pointing to it. If you found it before I lost it, then where? How? He leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It was years ago. I was in college, working a part-time job at this estate sale company. We were cleaning out this old house, and there it was, just sitting in a box with some other books. I don't know why, but it caught my attention. When I opened it and saw your name, your handwriting, I couldn't put it down. That doesn't make sense, I said, my voice sharp. That diary was in my room until I was 12. I didn't lose it until we moved. I know, he said. That's what doesn't add up. I shouldn't have been able to find it, but I did. I stared at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. And you just kept it? Read it. I didn't mean to, he said quickly. At first I was just curious. But the more I read, the more I felt like I had to protect you. Like I was supposed to. His words sent a chill through me. You sound like you were chosen or something. Like the diary picked you. Ben hesitated, then nodded. Maybe it did. I don't know. All I know is that after I found it, things started happening. What kind of things? At first, small things, he said. Coincidences. I'd think about you and then I'd see something related to you. An old photo, a name on a billboard, little reminders. And then as time went on, the diary started changing. Changing how? I asked, dread coiling in my stomach. New entries would appear, he said. Entries I hadn't seen before. They were always about you. About what was going to happen to you. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. And you wrote in it too. Why? I don't know, he admitted. It felt right. Like the diary wanted me to. And every time I did, it felt like I was leaving a message for you. Like I was helping. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. This was too much to process, too surreal to accept, and yet, the evidence was there. The notes, the future entries, the fact that he somehow knew things about me he couldn't have otherwise. So what now? I asked, my voice barely steady. What are we supposed to do? Ben met my gaze, his expression grave. We figure out what it's leading us to. Because whatever it is, it's not done with us yet. The weight of his words settled over me. Heavy and unshakable. As much as I wanted to deny it, part of me knew he was right. The diary wasn't just a relic of my past. It was a thread pulling us toward something. Something we couldn't ignore. And whether I liked it or not, I was caught in its web. The following days blurred together into a haze of late nights and hushed conversations. Ben and I sat side by side at the dining table, the diary open between us like some ancient text we were trying to decode. Every entry, every note, every seemingly insignificant detail. It all became a piece of the puzzle we couldn't quite solve. I've gone through it 100 times, Ben said one night, rubbing his temple. But maybe with you here we'll see something new. I flipped through the pages, scanning the familiar loops of my childhood handwriting. The margins, filled with Ben's words, were like echoes of a conversation I'd never had. There, I said, pointing to an entry near the middle. It was dated September 2nd, 2010, years after I'd lost the diary. This shouldn't be here. I read aloud, you'll meet him soon. Don't be afraid to trust him. Ben leaned closer, his brow furrowed. That's when I started my last year at college, he said. I remember finding a new note around that time. It's talking about you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's telling me to trust you. He sat back, exhaling deeply. It's like the diary knew I'd be in your life before I even knew it. The thought made my skin crawl. What if it's more than that? I asked. What if the diary wasn't just predicting things, it was causing them? Ben gave me a sharp look. You think it's manipulating us? Maybe, I said, feeling the weight of my words even as I spoke them. Think about it. You found it when you weren't supposed to. It brought you into my life. And now it's leading us somewhere, but we don't know where or why. He nodded slowly, his expression darkening. If that's true, then it's not just a diary. Something else. Something with intent. We fell silent, the air between us thick with unspoken fears. The diary lay open, its pages fluttering slightly in the faint draft from the window. It felt alive in a way that made me uneasy. Finally, I broke the silence. Ben, if the diary has been guiding us, changing things, then what happens if we don't follow it? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. I don't think we want to find out. That night I dreamt of the diary. In my dream its pages turned on their own, flipping faster and faster until they were a blur. Words spilled out of it, scrawled in my handwriting and Ben's, until the pages were black with ink. And then, as if in a final burst of fury, the diary snapped shut. I woke with a start, my heart racing. The room was dark, but I could see the faint outline of the diary on the nightstand. It looked harmless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I reached for my phone, needing some connection to the real world. It was nearly 3 a.m., and I had several unread messages. One was from Ben. I think I found something.
Come downstairs.
I threw on a robe and crept down the hall. The light in the kitchen was on, and Ben was hunched over the table, the diary open in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his eyes wide with urgency. I was going through it again, he said, his words spilling out in a rush. And I found a new entry. I froze. What do you mean a new entry? I haven't touched it since we stopped earlier. That's the thing, he said, his voice shaking. It wasn't there before. I moved closer, my stomach twisting as I peered over his shoulder. The new entry was written in my handwriting, the loops and curves identical, but I hadn't written it. It read, "Go to the house on Bellevue Road. You'll find the answers there." I stared at the words, my mind racing. Bellevue Road. I knew that street. It was on the outskirts of town, mostly abandoned properties and derelict houses. The thought of going there sent a shiver down my spine. Ben looked at me, his expression grim. It's telling us where to go. I shook my head, backing away. This is insane, Ben. We can't just. We don't have a choice, he said, cutting me off. It's been leading us to this. If we don't go, we'll never understand what's happening. I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to leave the diary and whatever secrets it held behind. But deep down I knew he was right. Fine, I said finally, my voice trembling. We'll go. But as I looked at the diary, its pages open and waiting, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into a trap. The following day the sky was overcast, casting a gray pall over everything. It felt fitting, as though the world itself understood the weight of what we were about to do. Ben and I didn't talk much during breakfast. Words seemed unnecessary, the tension between us saying everything that needed to be said. By the time we left the house, the air felt thick and oppressive. Bellevue Road wasn't far, a 15-minute drive at most, but the unease settled in my stomach as if we were embarking on a much longer journey. The diary sat between us on the seat, closed and silent, yet its presence felt suffocating. Are you sure about this? I asked, my voice cutting through the hum of the engine. Ben didn't take his eyes off the road. No, he admitted. But we don't have a better option. We turned onto Bellevue Road. The pavement cracked and overgrown with weeds. Most of the houses were boarded up or crumbling, their windows like dark, hollow eyes. It was the kind of place you avoided after dark, the kind of place where bad things lingered. Which house? I asked, scanning the empty streets. Ben glanced at the diary, then back at the road. We'll know it when we see it. I wanted to argue, to demand something more concrete, But the words died on my lips. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too. A strange pull like an invisible thread was guiding us. We passed 3 more houses before I saw it. A 2-story Victorian, its paint faded and peeling, its front door hanging slightly ajar. The air around it seemed heavier, darker, as though the house itself was alive. "That's it," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the seat. "How do you know?" "I just do," he said. "Don't you feel it?" I nodded reluctantly. I hated that he was right. We parked at the curb, the engine cutting off with a reluctant sputter. For a moment, neither of us moved. The house loomed ahead, silent and foreboding, daring us to step closer. "Let's get this over with," Ben said, breaking the silence. We stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the porch creaked ominously as we climbed the steps. My breath caught as Ben pushed the door open, the hinges groaning like something out of a horror movie. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. The hallway stretched ahead, its walls lined with faded wallpaper that might have once been cheerful. Now it looked sickly, the edges curling away like old scabs. "Where do we start?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ben held up the diary, flipping to the newest entry. "It doesn't say," he said, "but we'll know it when we see it." "That's not exactly comforting," I muttered. But I followed him anyway. We searched the ground floor first, moving room by room. The living room was filled with broken furniture and shattered glass. The kitchen smelled of decay, its counters littered with debris. Nothing seemed out of place. If anything, it was exactly what I'd expected from an abandoned house. It wasn't until we reached the staircase that I felt it again. That pull. It was subtle, like the faintest tug at the edge of my consciousness, but it was enough to make me stop. "Upstairs," I said, nodding toward the steps. Ben hesitated, but he must have felt it too, because he didn't argue. The stairs groaned under our weight, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top, the hallway stretched out before us, lined with doors that stood slightly ajar. We tried the first room, then the second, finding nothing but dust and shadows. It wasn't until the third door that we found something. The room was empty except for a single piece of furniture, an old wooden desk. On its surface sat a stack of papers and a small black notebook. Ben and I exchanged a glance before stepping inside. The air felt different here, thicker and colder. The notebook seemed to radiate an energy that made my skin crawl. Ben reached for it, his hand trembling slightly. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages. His expression darkened as he read, his knuckles white against the edge of the desk. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He looked up at me, his face pale. "It's a ledger," he said. "Dates, names, and events. Things that have happened. Things that are going to happen." I moved closer, peering over his shoulder. The handwriting wasn't mine or his. It was unfamiliar, jagged and sharp. But the names leaped off the page, and my stomach twisted as I recognized one of them. My own. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice shaking. Ben hesitated before pointing to a line halfway down the page. The words were clear, etched into my memory even as I read them. "Amy will discover the truth, but the cost will be her undoing." I staggered back, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. "What does that mean?" I demanded. "What truth? What cost?" Ben closed the notebook, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he said, "but I think we're about to find out." The room seemed to close in around us, the air thick and heavy, pressing down like an unseen weight. The notebook sat between us on the desk, its presence menacing. My heart pounded as I tried to process what I had just read. Ben's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the closed notebook. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low and urgent. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The pull that had brought us here now felt like a trap, like the house was alive and watching us. We backed out of the room, my eyes darting to the shadows, half expecting something to emerge from the darkness. As we descended the stairs, a sudden crash echoed through the house. I froze, gripping the banister as my pulse skyrocketed. "What was that?" I whispered. Ben held up a hand, signaling me to stay quiet. He moved ahead of me, his steps slow and deliberate. My breath caught as I followed, every creak of the floorboards setting my nerves on edge. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and Ben peered into the hallway. His shoulders tensed. "The front door," he said, his voice grim. "It's closed." "But we left it open," I said, my voice trembling. He nodded. "Someone's here." I swallowed hard, my hands shaking. "What do we do?" Ben glanced at me, his expression firm. "We get out." Quietly. He led the way down the hall, his movements careful but quick. The front door loomed ahead, its chipped paint and rusted hinges now looking more ominous than inviting. As we approached, the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows around us deeper. Ben reached for the doorknob, but before he could touch it, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind us. Slow and deliberate, they grew louder, closer. My stomach twisted into knots as I turned, my eyes darting to the darkened hallway. "Go," Ben whispered, his voice urgent. "Now." I hesitated, fear rooting me in place, but the sound of the footsteps spurred me into motion. I pushed past Ben and yanked the door open, the cold outside air hitting me like a slap. We stumbled onto the porch, and Ben slammed the door shut behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. My hands fumbled with the keys as I unlocked the doors, and we both climbed in, slamming them shut. I started the engine, my hands trembling on the wheel. Ben looked back at the house, his face pale. "Drive," he said. I didn't need to be told twice. The tires squealed as I pulled away, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to ask. "Who was that?" I finally managed, my voice shaking. "I don't know," Ben said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "But I don't think they wanted us to leave with the notebook." My stomach churned as I glanced at the notebook, now sitting on Ben's lap. Its black cover seemed to glisten in the dim light, as if mocking me. "What's in it, Ben?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What does it want?" He shook his head, his grip tightening on the notebook. "I don't know," he said, "but we're going to find out." Back at the house, the air was thick with tension. We sat at the dining table, the notebook between us like a live wire. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. Finally, Ben opened the notebook again. His hands were steady, but his expression was grim. "We need to know what we're dealing with," he said. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Start at the beginning." He flipped to the first page, and we both leaned in, our eyes scanning the unfamiliar handwriting. The entries were short and fragmented, each one more cryptic than the last. May 3rd, 1985. The first piece is in place. June 12th, 1992. The connection is established. August 20th, 2001. The guardian is chosen. What does that mean? I asked, my voice trembling. What connection? What guardian? Ben didn't answer. He kept flipping through the pages, his eyes narrowing as he read. Then he stopped, his finger hovering over a line near the bottom of the page. It read, "The guardian must protect the key. At all costs." "The key?" I said, my voice barely audible. "What's the key?" Ben looked up at me, his expression grim. "I think it's you, Amy." The words hit me like a blow, and I sank back in my chair, my mind spinning. "Why me?" I whispered. "Why is this happening to me?" "I don't know," Ben said, his voice tight. "But whatever this is, it's not random. The diary, the notebook, the entries, it's all connected. And you're at the center of it." The room seemed to grow colder as his words sank in. My hands trembled as I reached for the diary, flipping through its pages with a new sense of urgency. The answers we were looking for were here, buried in the cryptic messages and strange connections. But the more I read, the more I realized one terrifying truth. We weren't in control. The weight of Ben's words settled on me like a heavy blanket. My mind raced, trying to grasp the implications of what we'd found. I looked at the notebook and diary lying side by side on the table, their dark pages holding secrets that seemed to warp reality itself. "If I'm the key," I said, my voice barely steady, "then what does that make you?" Ben hesitated, his jaw tightening. "The guardian, I guess," he said quietly. "If what the notebook says is true." "That doesn't explain anything," I snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why us? Why now? None of this makes any sense." "I know it doesn't," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But we're not going to figure it out by panicking. We need to keep digging. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. Ben was right. We couldn't afford to let fear take over. Fine, I said. Let's focus on what we do know. The diary led us here, and now the notebook is talking about some connection. Maybe it's a clue. Ben flipped back to the earlier pages of the notebook, scanning them with sharp focus. The dates, he said suddenly, pointing to the first entry. 1985. That's the year I was born. I leaned in, my pulse quickening. And this one, I said, pointing to the entry marked 1992. I was 7 years old then. That's when I started keeping the diary. He nodded. And 2001, what about that year? I froze, my stomach twisting. That's the year my dad died. The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ben looked at me, his expression unreadable. You think it's connected? I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling. But it can't be a coincidence. Not with everything else. He nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the notebook. There's more here, he said, flipping through the pages. It's not just about the past, it's talking about what's coming. I stiffened, the memory of the chilling line from earlier flashing through my mind. Amy will discover the truth. But the cost will be her undoing. What truth? I asked, my voice sharp. What cost? Ben hesitated, his fingers tightening on the edge of the notebook. There's something here, he said. Something we're missing. The diary, the notebook, they're not just random. They're guiding us. Guiding us where? I demanded, my voice rising. I don't know, he said, his tone frustrated. But if we stop now, we might never find out. I leaned back in my chair, my mind churning. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to burn the notebook and bury the diary and pretend none of this had ever happened. But deep down I knew that wasn't an option. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until we saw it through. Fine, I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at me. What's next? Ben flipped to the most recent entry in the notebook. It was written in the same jagged handwriting as the rest, but the words felt sharper, more urgent. Go back to the beginning. The answers lie where it all began. The beginning? I said, frowning. What does that mean? Ben looked at me, his expression thoughtful. The beginning of what? The diary? The notebook? Or us, I said, the realization dawning on me. Where you found the diary? He nodded, his gaze sharpening. The estate sale. That house. My stomach twisted at the thought of going back, but I forced myself to nod. If that's where it started, then that's where we need to go. Ben closed the notebook, his jaw tight with determination. Then that's where we're going. The decision made, the air between us seemed to shift. The fear and uncertainty didn't vanish, but they were joined by something else. A grim resolve. Whatever waited for us at that house, it was time to face it. The drive to the estate sale house was tense and silent, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on both of us. The sky had turned slate gray, thick with clouds that threatened rain. The road stretched ahead like a path leading straight into the unknown. Do you remember exactly where it is? I asked, breaking the silence. Ben nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. It's in Oak Ridge, just past the old industrial park. It's been years, but I don't think I'll ever forget that place. Oak Ridge. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. It was the kind of neighborhood you avoided unless you had a specific reason to go. And even then you didn't linger. The houses were old and crumbling, the streets lined with abandoned cars and overgrown yards. It felt like a forgotten pocket of the world. When we pulled onto the street, I recognized it immediately. The house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, its sagging roof and peeling paint giving it an air of decay. The front yard was a tangled mess of weeds and brambles, and the windows were dark, their glass smeared with grime. This is it, Ben said, his voice quiet. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Are you sure? He nodded. Positive. We parked on the curb, the engine ticking as it cooled. Neither of us moved for a long moment, the house looming ahead like a silent sentinel. Finally, Ben unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. Let's get this over with, he said, his tone grim. I followed him up the cracked walkway, my footsteps faltering as we approached the front door. It was ajar, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The air inside smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic, and I had to fight the urge to turn around and run. Ben stepped inside first, his movements careful and deliberate. I followed, the floor creaking under my weight. The house was just as I imagined it would be, dark, dusty, and filled with the detritus of a life long abandoned. Furniture sat shrouded in white sheets, and cobwebs clung to every corner. "Where did you find it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "In the study," Ben said, nodding toward a doorway at the end of the hall. "It was in a box with some old books." We moved toward the study, the air growing colder with every step. The room was small and cluttered, the walls lined with sagging shelves filled with rotting books. In the center of the room sat a desk, its surface covered in dust and scattered papers. Ben pointed to a spot on the floor near the desk. The box was right there. I knelt down, brushing away the dirt and debris. The floorboards beneath were scuffed and uneven, and as I ran my hand over them, I felt a faint draft. I froze. "Ben," I said, my voice trembling, "there's something under here." He crouched beside me, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the floor. "A trapdoor." I nodded, my fingers finding the edge of a loose board. With some effort I pried it up, revealing a narrow opening that led to a dark space below. The air that wafted out was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint smell of earth. Ben reached for his phone, turning on the flashlight. He aimed the beam into the hole, revealing a set of rickety wooden stairs that descended into the darkness. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. Ben stood, his jaw tight. "There's something down there. I can feel it." I wanted to argue, to tell him we were in way over our heads, but the truth was I felt it too. The same pull that had brought us here was now urging us forward, daring us to descend. "Let's go," Ben said, his voice steady. I nodded, swallowing my fear as I followed him down the stairs. The wood groaned under our weight, and the air grew colder with every step. When we reached the bottom, the flashlight revealed a small dirt-floored room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars and trinkets, and in the center of the room sat a small, weathered table. On the table was a single object, a book. It was larger than the diary or the notebook, its leather cover cracked and ancient. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, and the air around it seemed to hum with energy. Ben stepped forward, his hand hovering over the book. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think it's what we've been looking for." As he reached for the book, the air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier and more oppressive. My breath caught as the symbols on the cover began to glow, faint at first but growing brighter with every passing second. "Ben," I said, my voice urgent, "maybe we shouldn't." But it was too late. His fingers brushed the cover, and the room erupted in light. A low hum filled the air, growing into a deafening roar. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes as the light consumed everything. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. When I opened my eyes, the room was dark again. The book was gone, and so was Ben. I stood frozen, the oppressive darkness pressing in on me like a suffocating blanket. My voice broke through the silence, hoarse and trembling. "Ben!" No response. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I fumbled for the flashlight he'd dropped. The weak beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty table where the book had been. "Ben!" I shouted this time, the sound of my voice bouncing off the dirt walls. There was no echo of his name, no sound of his footsteps, nothing. It was as if he had been swallowed whole. I moved forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The symbols that had glowed on the book's cover were etched faintly into the surface of the table. They seemed to pulse faintly, like the fading remnants of a fire. Come on," I muttered, my heart pounding as I scanned the room. My hands moved to the walls, searching for some kind of door, a hidden panel, anything. But the walls were solid, the earth cold and unyielding beneath my fingers. A faint sound behind me made me spin around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the dirt floor. It was a whisper, low and unintelligible, but it sent chills racing down my spine. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The whisper came again, louder this time, but still too garbled to understand. It seemed to come from all around me, filling the small room with its sinister echo. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my palms slick with sweat. "Ben!" I screamed, my voice raw with desperation. "Where are you?" The whisper shifted, coalescing into words that made my blood run cold. He is where you must go. I turned in a frantic circle, the flashlight beam darting wildly. The voice was deep and resonant, neither male nor female, and it seemed to seep into my very bones. Who are you? I demanded, my throat dry. What do you want? There was no answer. The symbols on the table pulsed again, brighter this time, and the air in the room grew colder. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand as the symbols began to glow with an otherworldly light. A sudden rush of wind whipped through the room, stirring the dirt on the floor and sending papers and jars crashing to the ground. The light from the symbols coalesced into a single point, hovering above the table, and then exploded outward, engulfing me in its brilliance. I screamed, the world around me dissolving into light and sound. My senses were overwhelmed, my vision blurred, my ears filled with a deafening hum. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I opened my eyes, blinking against the sudden darkness. The room was gone. The walls, the shelves, the table, everything had vanished. I was standing in a vast open space, the ground beneath my feet smooth and cold. Ben! I called out, my voice trembling. This time I heard something, a faint sound like the echo of footsteps. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat, and saw a figure in the distance. It was Ben. Ben! I shouted, running toward him. Relief flooded through me as I drew closer, but it was short-lived. The look on his face stopped me in my tracks. His expression was blank, his eyes unfocused. He stood motionless as though he couldn't see me, couldn't hear me. Ben! I cried, reaching out to touch his arm. The moment my fingers brushed his skin, his eyes snapped to mine. But they weren't his eyes. They were glowing the same light as the symbols on the book. Amy, he said, his voice low and echoing. You shouldn't have followed. What's happening? I asked, my voice shaking. Where are we? He tilted his head, as if considering the question. This is the beginning, he said. And the end. I backed away, fear clawing at my chest. What are you talking about? What happened to you? Ben, or whatever he had become, took a step toward me. The key has been turned. The path is open. There's no going back now. I don't understand. I shouted, tears streaming down my face. What does that mean? What path? What are you talking about? He reached for me, his hand glowing with the same strange light. You'll understand soon enough. Before I could move, the light engulfed me again, and the world dissolved into nothingness. I awoke with a start, gasping for air. My hands clutched at the ground beneath me, solid, cold earth. The disorienting light was gone, replaced by pitch black. My heart raced as I sat up, trying to steady my breathing. My surroundings were silent, oppressive, and unfamiliar. Ben! I called out, my voice echoing into the void. The silence that followed was deafening. I reached out blindly, my hands sweeping over the ground in search of something, anything that could anchor me. My fingers brushed against something smooth and cool. The flashlight. Relief flooded through me as I fumbled to turn it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow, cavern-like space. The walls were rough, damp stone, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and something metallic. I shivered, the chill seeping into my bones. I stood slowly, shining the light in every direction. There was no sign of Ben, no indication of where I was or how I'd gotten here. The last thing I remembered was his glowing eyes and the cryptic words he'd spoken. The key has been turned. The path is open. What key? What path? None of it made sense, and the questions swirling in my mind only heightened my fear. The sound of movement behind me made me freeze. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my grip. Who's there? No response. My breathing quickened as I took a cautious step forward, the beam of light sweeping over the cavern walls. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows just beyond the flashlight's reach. Ben! I whispered, hope and dread mingling in my voice. The figure stepped forward and my stomach dropped. It wasn't Ben. It was someone or something else. The figure was tall and humanoid, but its features were blurred, as if its face were made of smoke and shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same eerie light that had consumed the symbols on the book. You've come far, it said, its voice a strange mix of male and female tones. But the journey is only beginning. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking. Who are you? What do you want? The figure tilted its head, the movement unnervingly fluid. I am the keeper, it said. The one who safeguards the path. The path to what? I demanded, my voice trembling. What is this place? Where is Ben? The keeper's glowing eyes seemed to pierce through me. The guardian has fulfilled his role. The key has been turned. Now it is up to you to finish what has begun. I don't know what you're talking about. I shouted, my frustration boiling over. I didn't ask for any of this. I just want Ben back. The keeper raised a shadowy hand, and the air around me grew colder. You were chosen, Amy. The diary, the notebook, the house, it was all for you. The key is in your hands now. The answers you seek lie ahead. Chosen for what? I asked, tears streaming down my face. Why me? The keeper didn't answer. Instead, it pointed to a dark tunnel that stretched beyond the edge of the cavern. The air around the entrance seemed to shimmer, as though it were alive. Follow the path, it said. There you will find what you seek. I looked at the tunnel, my heart pounding. Everything in me screamed to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something deeper, something I couldn't explain, urged me forward. I turned back to the keeper, my voice trembling. And if I don't? The glow in its eyes brightened. Then the path will find you. And it will not be kind. A chill ran down my spine, and I clenched the flashlight tighter. I didn't know what waited for me in that tunnel, but I knew I didn't have a choice. If there was even a chance of finding Ben, or understanding what was happening, I had to keep going. With a deep breath, I stepped toward the tunnel. The keeper watched silently as I passed, its form dissolving into shadow as I moved forward. The air inside the tunnel was colder, heavier, and the light from my flashlight seemed to barely penetrate the darkness ahead. Each step felt like it carried me deeper into the unknown, the weight of the diary and notebook pressing on my mind like a tangible force. Whatever lay at the end of this path, I knew it was only the beginning. The tunnel seemed endless. Each step echoed back to me, a hollow reminder of how alone I was in this. The flashlight beam barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and the air grew colder the farther I went. My breath fogged in the dim light, each exhale a shiver of fear. Ben! I whispered, my voice barely audible. But only the echoes answered me. The walls began to change. What had once been rough stone now seemed smoother, almost polished, as if shaped by deliberate hands. Strange symbols etched into the surface glowed faintly as I passed, the same eerie light I'd seen on the book. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, the coldness of the stone sending a jolt through me. They weren't just decorations. They felt alive. Why me? I muttered under my breath, my voice trembling. What do you want from me? The tunnel didn't answer, but the faint hum in the air seemed to grow louder, resonating through the stone. It was as if the path itself was responding, urging me onward. After what felt like hours, I came to a fork. Two passages stretched ahead, each identical in its darkness. I shined the flashlight down one, then the other, searching for any clue as to which way to go. Left, a voice whispered, soft and fleeting. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Who's there? I demanded, spinning in a circle, the flashlight beam darting wildly. No one. The whisper came again, more insistent. Left. I hesitated, every instinct screaming to turn back, to run. But the pull, the same pull that had brought me this far, was stronger. Against my better judgment, I turned left. The air grew colder still, and the hum in the walls shifted to a faint vibration I could feel in my chest. My footsteps quickened, though I wasn't sure if it was out of determination or fear. The tunnel narrowed, the walls pressing closer until I had to stoop slightly to continue. The symbols here glowed brighter, their light casting strange, flickering shadows. Finally, the tunnel opened into a chamber. The room was vast, its ceiling lost to the darkness above. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it sat an object that made my breath catch in my throat. The book. The same one from the house. But it was different now. The leather cover shimmered with faint iridescence, the symbols on its surface shifting and changing as if alive. The air around it pulsed with energy, and I could feel it drawing me in, demanding my attention. I stepped closer, my feet moving of their own accord. The flashlight fell from my hand, the beam rolling across the chamber floor. But I didn't care. My focus was on the book. Every instinct told me not to touch it, but I couldn't stop myself. As my fingers brushed the cover, the room seemed to explode with light. A wave of heat and cold rushed over me, and the ground beneath my feet vanished. I felt weightless, suspended in a void of light and sound. And then I saw him. Ben. He was standing in the distance, surrounded by swirling tendrils of light. His eyes were wide, his face a mix of relief and fear. "Amy," he called out, his voice echoing across the void. "Ben." I tried to move toward him, but the light seemed to push against me, holding me in place. "What's happening? Where are we?" "I don't know," he shouted, his voice trembling. "But I think this is what it wanted. Us here. Together. What does it want?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "What are we supposed to do?" Before he could answer, the light surged again, and a new voice filled the space. Deep, resonant, and otherworldly, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are the key," it said, its tone both commanding and eerie. "The cycle begins and ends with you." "What cycle?" I shouted, frustration and fear boiling over. "What do you want from us?" The light around Ben shifted, the tendrils wrapping around him like chains. He struggled, his face contorted in pain. "Amy, don't let it take you," he shouted. "Fight it." The voice spoke again, louder now. "The path is set. The truth will be revealed. But only one may walk forward." My chest tightened, and I felt the pull again, stronger than ever. It wasn't just pulling me toward the book. It was pulling me away from Ben. The space between us seemed to stretch, the light forming an impassable barrier. "No!" I screamed, reaching for him. "I'm not leaving you. You must choose," the voice said. "The guardian or the key." I froze, the weight of the choice crashing down on me. The light around Ben flared, and his voice broke through the chaos, raw and desperate. "Amy, don't choose me. Finish this. Stop whatever this is." Tears streamed down my face as I stared at him, my heart breaking. "I can't," I whispered. "I can't do this without you." "You can," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "You have to." The light surged again, and the voice spoke one final time. "Choose." I closed my eyes, my mind racing. My hand hovered over the book, the pull stronger than ever. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew Ben was right. This wasn't just about us. It was bigger, more dangerous. "I'm sorry," I whispered. And then I made my choice. As my hand closed over the book, the world shifted violently. The light flared, blinding and searing, and the chamber around me seemed to dissolve into nothingness. I felt the ground drop away, a dizzying sensation of freefall gripping me, but the book anchored me. Its surface was cool and steady beneath my fingers, its weight grounding me as everything else spun out of control. The voice thundered around me, deep and resonant, reverberating in my chest. "The key has turned. The cycle begins anew." "No," I screamed, clinging to the book as if it were the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "What did I do? Where is Ben?" The light dimmed slowly, and I found myself standing in a place that felt both familiar and alien. The air was thick, shimmering with a strange energy that buzzed faintly against my skin. All around me, towering structures of obsidian rose into the sky, their surfaces etched with glowing symbols that shifted and pulsed like living things. The ground beneath me was smooth and cold, a reflective surface that mirrored the swirling chaos above. I turned in frantic circles, searching for any sign of Ben. "Ben!" I called out, my voice echoing into the void. "Where are you?" The silence was deafening. The book in my hands began to hum, the vibration traveling up my arms. The symbols on its cover glowed brighter, and the leather grew warm under my fingers. It was guiding me, I realized, pulling me forward like a compass. I took a hesitant step, then another, the book's hum growing stronger with each movement. Ahead, a figure emerged from the shadows. My heart leapt, hope blooming in my chest. "Ben!" But as I drew closer, the figure became clearer, and my hope dissolved into fear. It wasn't Ben. It wasn't even human. The being was tall and thin, its form shrouded in flowing robes that seemed to ripple like liquid shadow. Its face was featureless, a blank expanse of smooth glowing light. It turned toward me, its presence oppressive and otherworldly. "You have chosen," it said, its voice echoing like a chorus of whispers. The path is yours to walk. What path? I demanded, clutching the book tighter. What does this mean? Where's Ben? The being tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a shiver down my spine. The guardian has fulfilled his purpose. The key must now unlock the truth. Stop talking in riddles, I shouted, my voice cracking. What is this place? What do you want from me? The being raised a hand, its long, shadowy fingers unfurling like smoke. This is the nexus, the point where all threads converge. You are the thread that binds them. I don't understand, I said, tears welling in my eyes. I just want to go home. I want Ben back. The being's voice softened, though it was no less chilling. Home is no longer what it was. The key cannot return until the cycle is complete. And what happens if I don't? I asked, my voice trembling. The being paused, as if considering my question. The cycle will collapse. The threads will unravel, and the balance will fall. I stared at it, the weight of its words pressing down on me like a crushing wave. The book in my hands pulsed again, and I looked down at it, the symbols on its cover shifting and glowing brighter. What am I supposed to do? I whispered. The being gestured to the structures around us, their glowing symbols intensifying. Follow the book. It will guide you to the heart of the nexus. There you will find the truth. I looked at the book, then back at the being. And Ben? Is he gone? The being was silent for a long moment before answering. The guardian's fate is tied to yours. Complete the cycle, and his thread may yet endure. It turned away, its form dissolving into shadow as it moved toward the towering structures. I stood there, the weight of the book in my hands suddenly unbearable. My legs felt weak, my mind racing with questions I didn't have the strength to ask. But one thing was clear, I had no choice. Whatever this cycle was, whatever truth the book held, I had to see it through. For Ben, for myself, for everything that was at stake. With a deep breath, I clutched the book tighter and stepped forward into the unknown. The path before me shimmered like liquid light, twisting and turning in impossible ways. I clutched the book tightly, its warmth pulsing against my palms as if alive. Each step I took sent ripples through the ground, as though the space itself was responding to my presence. The structures around me grew taller, their glowing symbols shifting and swirling in patterns that defied logic. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating in my chest like the rhythm of an unseen heartbeat. I followed the pull of the book, each step feeling heavier than the last. Ahead, a massive doorway loomed, its archway carved with intricate patterns that seemed to move under my gaze. The air around it shimmered, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I stopped in front of it, staring up at its sheer size. The book in my hands pulsed, the symbols on its cover glowing brighter. The doorway began to shift, the carvings rearranging themselves to form new patterns. A voice, deep, resonant and commanding, echoed through the space. You stand at the threshold of the truth, it said. Beyond lies the heart of the cycle. Step forward, key. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The thought of what might lie beyond that doorway made my chest tighten. But the book pulsed again, insistent. What happens if I go through? I asked, my voice trembling. The voice replied. The truth will be revealed, the balance restored. And if I don't? The cycle will collapse. All threads will unravel. I swallowed hard, my grip on the book tightening. Will Ben be there? Will I find him? The guardian's fate is tied to yours, the voice said. To walk the path is to decide his thread. The weight of the choice pressed down on me. My instinct screamed to turn back, but I knew there was no going back, not now. I had come too far, and the pull of the book was impossible to ignore. With a deep breath, I stepped forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The hum grew deafening, the symbols on the doorway flaring with blinding light. I shielded my eyes, stumbling forward into the unknown. The light swallowed me, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sensation of falling. When the light faded, I found myself standing in a vast circular chamber. The walls were smooth and reflective, like polished obsidian, and the floor beneath me pulsed faintly with light. In the center of the chamber stood a massive, glowing orb, its surface swirling with colors that seemed to contain entire galaxies. The book in my hands grew heavier, the symbols on its cover glowing in harmony with the orb. I approached it cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The closer I got, the more I could feel the energy radiating from it. An overwhelming presence that seemed to seep into my very soul. The orb shifted, its colors intensifying as a figure began to emerge from within. My breath caught as the form took shape, solidifying into something familiar. It was Ben.
Ben!
I called out, running toward him. He turned to face me, his eyes wide with recognition. "Amy," he said, his voice a mix of relief and fear. "You shouldn't have come." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, stopping just short of him. "I came to find you." He shook his head, his expression pained. "This isn't about me. It's about you. The cycle. It's centered on you." "I don't care about the cycle," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I just want to bring you back. I want this to end." The orb behind him pulsed, its light casting strange shadows across his face. "If you complete the cycle," he said, "you'll have to make a choice. The key can only unlock the truth at a cost." "What cost?" I asked, my voice trembling. Ben looked away, his hands clenching at his sides. "You'll understand when the time comes." Before I could respond, the chamber began to shake, the light from the orb flaring brighter. The book in my hands pulsed violently, the symbols on its cover shifting and rearranging themselves. The voice returned, booming and commanding. "The cycle nears completion. The key must choose." Ben reached for me, his eyes pleading. "Amy, whatever happens, remember, this is bigger than us. You have to finish it." The orb pulsed again, and I felt the pull return, stronger than ever. It dragged me forward, toward the center of the chamber, toward the swirling light of the orb. I stumbled, the weight of the book pulling me down. "Amy," Ben shouted, his voice desperate. "You can do this." I looked back at him, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know how," I whispered. The voice echoed again, louder this time. "The truth lies within. Step forward, key." The pull became unbearable, and I took a hesitant step toward the orb. The light enveloped me, and for a moment, I felt as though I were being torn apart. And then I was inside. Inside the orb, the world dissolved into light and sound, a kaleidoscope of shifting colors and echoes that seemed to seep into my very being. My body felt weightless, suspended in the swirling void. I couldn't tell where I ended and the space began. The voice echoed around me, no longer external but inside my mind. "You have stepped into the heart of the cycle. The threads of time and truth converge here." The light began to shift, forming shapes and patterns. At first, they were abstract, but gradually they solidified into scenes, images from my life. I saw myself as a child, clutching the diary in my tiny hands. My father building a treehouse. My first recital. My wedding day. Each memory played out before me like a film, vivid and alive. But the scenes didn't stop there. They began to change, showing moments I didn't recognize. Moments that hadn't happened yet. I saw myself standing at a crossroads, Ben at my side, the book glowing in my hands. I saw myself alone, the orb behind me dimming to darkness. I saw a world crumbling, its threads unraveling into chaos. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why are you showing me this?" "These are the possibilities," the voice said. "The paths you may walk, the choices you may make, the truth you may uncover." I reached out, my fingers brushing one of the images. It rippled under my touch, the scene shifting to show Ben standing alone, his face etched with sorrow. My chest tightened as I watched him reach for something unseen, his hand closing around empty air. "Ben," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Why is this happening?" The voice answered, calm and unwavering. "The cycle must maintain balance. The key and the guardian are its anchors. One must unlock the truth. The other must protect it." "What does that mean?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "Protect it from what?" "From what lies beyond," the voice said, its tone darkening. "The threads of time and existence are fragile. The truth binds them. Without balance, all will unravel." I stared at the shifting images, my heart pounding. What am I supposed to do? The light around me began to dim, the swirling colors fading to a deep, pulsating blue. The voice grew louder, filling my mind completely. "You must choose." The images coalesced into two distinct paths, each one glowing faintly. One led to a vision of myself standing alone, the book in my hands, the world around me calm and whole. The other showed Ben, his hand extended toward me, his face full of hope and pain. You cannot walk both paths, the voice said. To save the cycle, you must decide, the truth or the guardian. I froze, the weight of the decision crashing down on me. The truth or Ben, the cycle or the one person who had stood by me through all of this. My hands trembled as I looked between the two paths, the light from the orb growing dimmer by the second. I can't, I whispered. I can't make that choice. You must, the voice insisted. The threads depend on you. Tears streamed down my face as I turned to the vision of Ben, his eyes meeting mine through the shifting light. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice breaking. I don't know how to do this without you. You'll find a way, his voice echoed, soft but steady. You're stronger than you think. I closed my eyes, the weight of the book in my hands grounding me. The path was clear, even if it broke me to walk it. I'm sorry, I whispered again. And then I chose the truth. The moment the decision left me, the light surged, blinding and overwhelming. I felt the pull again, stronger than ever, dragging me forward as the world dissolved into chaos. Ben's voice called out one last time, his words lost in the roar of the orb. Then there was silence. The silence was deafening, vast and infinite, as though the universe itself had paused to hold its breath. My body felt weightless, suspended in a void without boundaries. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light that surrounded me. The orb was gone, the swirling colors and overwhelming presence replaced by a stark emptiness. I stood on a platform of smooth, dark stone, suspended in an endless expanse of gray light. The book was still in my hands, its surface cool and still. The symbols that had once pulsed with energy were now faint, their glow reduced to embers. Where am I? I asked aloud, my voice trembling. It echoed back to me, distant and hollow. The Nexus, the voice replied, softer now but still commanding. The heart of the cycle. The truth lies within. I turned in a slow circle, searching for the source of the voice. What truth? I made the choice. I chose the truth. Now tell me, what is it? The air shimmered, and the gray light around me began to coalesce into forms. Figures emerged, indistinct at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. They surrounded me, spectral and ethereal, their eyes glowing faintly with the same light that had filled the orb. You are the key, one of them said, their voice overlapping with the others in a haunting chorus. The guardian was your anchor, but the cycle demands completion. The truth is not a single revelation. It is a burden. A burden. I echoed, my chest tightening. What kind of burden? The figures moved closer, their presence suffocating. To hold the truth is to carry the threads of existence. To bind the past, the present, and the future. To ensure balance. The words sank into me like a stone, their weight crushing. You're telling me I have to maintain this? Forever? Yes, they said in unison. The cycle is eternal. Without the key, it collapses. I staggered back, the platform beneath me solid but unyielding. The enormity of what they were saying was too much to comprehend. And Ben? I asked, my voice cracking. What happens to him? The figures were silent for a moment, their glowing eyes fixed on me. Finally, one of them spoke. The guardian's thread is tied to yours. He exists because you chose to let him. I didn't want to let him go, I said, tears streaming down my face. I didn't want any of this. Yet you chose, they said, their voices unwavering. The key does not choose lightly. The guardian's sacrifice ensured your path. You must now ensure his. The words felt like a blow, the finality of them leaving me breathless. I looked down at the book in my hands, its faint glow a reminder of everything I had lost and everything I had yet to face. What do I do now? I whispered. The figures stepped back, their forms beginning to dissolve into the gray light. Follow the threads, they said. Hold the balance. And remember, the truth is not the end. It is the beginning. As their forms faded, the light around me began to shift again. The platform trembled beneath my feet, and the air hummed with a new energy. The book grew heavier in my hands, its symbols flaring back to life. The space around me fractured, the gray light shattering like glass. I was falling again, the void rushing past me in a blur of color and sound. And then with a jarring thud I landed. I was back in the house. The study, with its sagging shelves and scattered papers, felt almost surreal after what I had just experienced. The book was still in my hands, its glow fading until it was no brighter than a dying ember. I looked around, my breath catching.
Ben!
I called out, my voice hoarse. The house was silent. Tears welled in my eyes as I sank to my knees, clutching the book to my chest. I had made the choice. I had chosen the truth. But at what cost? The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. And then faintly I heard it. A voice, distant but familiar. Amy. I turned, my heart leaping.
Ben!
But there was no one there. Only the echo of his voice, like a thread stretching across the void. Faint but unbroken. I stood, the book still heavy in my hands, and wiped the tears from my face. The path was mine to walk now. The cycle was mine to bear. And though I was alone, I held on to the faint hope that somewhere, somehow, Ben's thread still lingered. The days after returning to the house passed in a haze. The diary and the book sat on the desk in front of me, their presence a constant reminder of the choice I had made and the burden I now carried. The air in the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened. I spent hours flipping through the book, trying to decipher its shifting symbols and cryptic messages. The diary lay closed beside it, the margins filled with Ben's words, a haunting echo of everything we had been through. But Ben's voice, I could still hear it sometimes, faint like a whisper carried on the wind, calling my name. It wasn't enough to guide me, but it was enough to keep me going. On the third night the book changed. I was sitting at the desk, staring blankly at its pages, when the symbols began to shift. They moved faster than before, forming words that glowed faintly in the dim light. The threads unravel. The guardian remains. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. The guardian remains. Did that mean Ben was still alive? Still connected to the cycle somehow? Ben, I whispered, clutching the book. Where are you? The symbols shifted again, rearranging themselves into a new message. Seek the nexus. The guardian's thread lies within. The nexus. I'd been there before, or at least I thought I had. The swirling light, the overwhelming energy. It had felt like the center of everything. But how was I supposed to return? The pull that had guided me before was gone, leaving only the faint hum of the book's presence. I flipped through its pages, searching for more clues. The symbols seemed to ripple under my touch, but they didn't form new words. Frustration bubbled in my chest, and I slammed the book shut, leaning back in my chair. Give me something, I muttered. Anything. The air in the room grew colder, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the house. I froze, my breath catching. Ben! I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and moved toward the sound, my footsteps hesitant. The hallway was dark, the shadows stretching long and foreboding. I shone the light ahead, half expecting to see nothing. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. My heart leapt into my throat as I took a step closer, the flashlight trembling in my hands. Ben! I called out, my voice cracking. The figure turned, stepping into the light. My breath caught as I recognized him. His face, his eyes, his presence. It was Ben. But something was wrong. His eyes glowed faintly, the same eerie light I had seen in the Nexus. His expression was distant, as though he were looking through me rather than at me. Amy, he said, his voice soft and hollow. I rushed toward him, tears streaming down my face. Ben! You're here. You're. He held up a hand, stopping me in my tracks. You shouldn't have come back, he said, his tone laced with warning. I froze, confusion and fear twisting in my chest. What do you mean? I've been trying to find you. I thought. You chose the truth, he interrupted, his glowing eyes locking onto mine. But the truth has consequences. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice trembling. You're here. You're alive. Alive. He let out a hollow laugh, the sound sending chills down my spine. I'm not alive, Amy. Not in the way you think. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. No. You're here. I can see you, I can hear you. I'm a thread, he said, his voice quieter now. A remnant of what I was. Tied to the cycle because of the choice you made. Tears blurred my vision as I took a hesitant step toward him. I didn't know. I didn't understand what would happen. I just wanted to save you. You did, he said, his tone softening. But at a cost. The cycle demanded balance, and we're both a part of it now. I felt the weight of his words like a physical blow. What does that mean? What happens to us? Ben's expression darkened. The cycle is eternal, Amy. We're bound to it now, tied to the threads that hold everything together. I'll always be here. But never truly. No, I whispered, my chest tightening. There has to be a way to break this. To bring you back. His gaze softened, and for a moment I saw the Ben I knew, the man who had stood by me through everything. Some things can't be undone, he said. But you're strong, Amy. Stronger than you realize. I reached out for him, but he stepped back, his form flickering like a dying light. Ben, don't go, I pleaded, my voice breaking. He smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression that broke my heart. I'll always be here, he said. You'll hear me. You'll feel me. But the path you chose is yours to walk. The light in his eyes grew brighter, and his form began to dissolve, fading into the shadows. I reached out, my hand grasping at empty air as his voice echoed one final time. Hold the balance, Amy. The cycle depends on you. And then he was gone. The silence after Ben disappeared was suffocating. I stood frozen in the dark hallway, staring at the spot where he had been moments ago. His final words echoed in my mind, each one a dagger twisting deeper into my chest. Hold the balance, Amy. The cycle depends on you. I sank to the floor, clutching the book tightly to my chest as if it could anchor me to reality. Tears streamed down my face, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. He was gone, not completely but gone enough. Bound to the cycle just like I was. A thread, a remnant. The realization hit me like a blow. I had chosen this. I had made the choice to bear the truth, to carry the weight of the cycle, and in doing so I had lost him. The house felt unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that seemed alive, pressing in on me. I needed to move, to do something, anything, to keep from drowning in the crushing weight of it all. With trembling hands I forced myself to stand, the book heavy in my grasp. Its faint glow was the only light in the room, a reminder of the burden I now carried. Okay, I whispered, my voice shaky but firm. If this is my path, I need to figure out how to walk it. I returned to the study, my legs feeling like lead. The desk was exactly as I'd left it, the diary sitting closed beside the scattered papers. I placed the book next to it, the two objects side by side like twin anchors in the chaos of my life. I opened the book again, the symbols on its pages shifting and rearranging themselves. The hum of energy returned, faint but steady, and I felt the pull of the cycle once more. It wasn't as overwhelming as before, more like a thread tugging at the edge of my consciousness. The symbols began to form words, their glow faint but legible. The threads are fragile. Balance must be maintained. I frowned, running my fingers over the page. What does that mean? I asked aloud. How am I supposed to maintain the balance? The symbols shifted again, forming a new message. Follow the threads. Protect the cycle. Restore what is broken. Restore what's broken? I repeated, my voice tinged with frustration. How? Where do I even start? The book didn't answer. The symbols faded, leaving the pages blank. I let out a frustrated sigh, slamming it shut. Great. Cryptic messages and no instructions. Typical. I slumped into the chair, burying my face in my hands. The weight of everything pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. I thought of Ben, his voice, his face, the way he had smiled at me even in the end. He had believed in me, even when I hadn't believed in myself. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered, my voice cracking. But deep down, I knew I didn't have a choice. The cycle wouldn't stop, wouldn't relent. It had chosen me, and now I had to choose to fight. For Ben, for myself, for everything. I took a deep breath, wiping the tears from my face. The diary caught my eye, its familiar leather cover a stark contrast to the ancient, glowing book beside it. I opened it, flipping through the pages filled with my childhood handwriting and Ben's notes in the margins. One note stood out, written in his familiar hand. You're stronger than you think. I traced the words with my fingers, a small ember of resolve sparking in my chest. Ben had believed in me. The cycle had chosen me, and now I had to live up to both. I closed the diary and stood, the book glowing faintly beside me. The pull was there again, stronger now, guiding me forward. It wasn't the end, far from it. This was just the beginning. With the book in hand, I stepped into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. The pull of the book guided me beyond the confines of the house, into the cold night air. The world outside felt different, sharper, heavier, as if the very atmosphere had changed. The stars above seemed brighter, their light piercing through the darkness like a map waiting to be read. I clutched the book tightly, its faint hum vibrating through my hands. Each step I took felt deliberate, guided by an unseen force. The book wasn't just leading me, it was tethering me to something larger, a thread woven into the fabric of this cycle I now found myself bound to. The pull led me down empty streets and shadowed alleys, the familiar townscape feeling alien under the weight of my new reality. Every sound, a rustling leaf, the creak of a gate, set my nerves on edge. But I kept moving, the book's quiet insistence propelling me forward. I didn't know where I was going until I arrived. It was a clearing on the outskirts of town, a place I hadn't been to since I was a child. The remnants of an old playground stood in the moonlight, the rusted swing set swaying gently in the breeze. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. "This can't be right," I muttered, staring at the empty space. "Why here?" The book pulsed, its glow intensifying. The pull was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I stepped forward, my feet crunching on the frost-covered grass. The air here was different, thicker, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. In the center of the clearing, the ground began to shimmer. Symbols like those etched into the book appeared, glowing faintly in the frost. The patterns spread outward, forming a circle that pulsed in time with the book in my hands. I hesitated, my breath visible in the cold air. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The book answered, its symbols shifting rapidly. Words formed on the page, glowing brighter with each passing second. "The nexus awakens. Step into the thread." The nexus. The place where all threads converge. Where I had been before. Or at least somewhere like it. My stomach churned at the thought of going back, but the pull was insistent. This was the next step. The only step. I stepped into the circle. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the air around me erupted in light and sound. The clearing dissolved into a swirl of colors, the symbols on the ground rising like smoke to envelop me. I felt weightless, untethered, as though I had been pulled from the fabric of reality itself. When the light faded, I found myself in a place both familiar and alien. It was the nexus, but it wasn't the swirling chaos I had seen before. This was different, calm, vast and infinite. Threads of light stretched out in every direction, connecting points in the distance that pulsed faintly like stars. The book hummed in my hands, the glow of its symbols matching the rhythm of the threads. I turned in a slow circle, my eyes wide as I took in the expanse. It was beautiful and terrifying, a tapestry of light and energy that seemed to hold the weight of everything. "The threads," I whispered, reaching out to touch one. The moment my fingers brushed the light, images flooded my mind. Memories, moments, lives, threads weaving together in an intricate dance. I saw my own life, the choices I had made, the moments that had defined me. And then I saw Ben, his thread stretching alongside mine, faint but unbroken. "Ben," I said, tears springing to my eyes. "You're still here." The book in my hands pulsed again, the symbols shifting rapidly. A new message formed, the letters burning brightly on the page. "The Guardian's thread is weak. Restore it." My chest tightened as I read the words. Restore it. Was it possible? Could I bring him back fully and completely? The thought filled me with equal parts hope and fear. If I could do it, what would it cost? The threads around me pulsed, the energy in the nexus growing stronger. The book's hum grew louder, more insistent. I looked at Ben's thread, faint but steady, and made my decision. With trembling hands, I placed the book at the center of the nexus, its glow intensifying as it connected with the surrounding threads. The energy surged, the threads shifting and weaving together in a blinding display of light. My heart pounded as I reached for Ben's thread, grasping it tightly. "Hold on, Ben," I whispered. "I'm not letting you go." The light around me exploded, consuming everything in its brilliance. The hum of the nexus grew deafening, and I felt the threads tighten. pulling me deeper into the fabric of the cycle. My grip on Ben's thread never wavered, even as the energy surged around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. The nexus fell silent, the threads still and calm. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and turned to look at the space where Ben's thread had been. It pulsed brightly now, its glow strong and steady. And then from the shadows of the nexus, a figure emerged. It was him. "Ben," I said, my voice trembling with relief and disbelief. He looked at me, his eyes wide with recognition and awe. "Amy," he said, his voice raw. "You did it." I ran to him, throwing my arms around him as tears streamed down my face. He was real, solid, warm, alive. The threads pulsed around us, the cycle humming faintly in the background, and for the first time, I felt like we might truly be free. But deep down, I knew the journey wasn't over. The cycle had been restored, but its balance was fragile. The truth I carried was still a burden, one that would demand everything of me. And yet, as I held Ben close, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. As I held Ben close, the threads around us pulsed, the nexus humming faintly with a rhythm that seemed alive. The air buzzed with an unspoken energy, a reminder that our reunion was not the end, only a pause in the chaos. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Did I fix it?" Ben pulled back, his hands resting on my shoulders as he looked into my eyes. "You've restored the cycle," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't place. "But it's not over." The nexus shimmered, and the threads above us began to shift. A low hum filled the space, growing louder until it became a roar. I turned, clutching Ben's hand as the threads twisted into patterns I couldn't decipher. The book still sat at the center of the nexus, its glow intensifying, the symbols on its cover shifting rapidly. "The cycle is alive," Ben said, his gaze fixed on the swirling threads. "It's adjusting to what you've done." "What does that mean?" I asked, dread tightening in my chest. Before he could answer, the voice returned, deep, resonant, and commanding, but no longer cold. There was a warmth to it now, an almost paternal presence. "The cycle is whole, but the balance remains fragile." The book rose from the nexus, floating in the air between us. Its light was blinding now, the symbols pulsing like a heartbeat. "The key and the guardian are bound," the voice continued, "but the path ahead is uncertain." Ben stepped forward, his hand still in mine. "What path? What else do you need from us?" The book turned in midair, its pages flipping rapidly. The symbols formed a new message, glowing with clarity. "The threads are many. Balance requires more than one." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice cracking. "More than one what?" The nexus trembled, the threads rippling outward like waves in a vast ocean. The voice answered, its tone soft but firm. "You have stabilized the cycle, but the threads must be guarded. The key and the guardian cannot bear this alone." Ben and I exchanged a glance, the weight of the words settling between us. "Others," he said, realization dawning in his eyes. "It needs others to share the burden." The threads around us began to glow brighter, and faint shapes emerged within them. People, figures suspended in the light, their faces shadowed but familiar. I recognized some of them, people from my life, from Ben's, strangers I had passed on the street, friends I hadn't seen in years. "It's calling them," I whispered. "Like it called us." Ben nodded, his grip on my hand tightening. "It's building something. A network." The figures began to move, their threads intertwining with the nexus, each one adding to the web of light. The book floated higher, its glow spreading outward like a beacon. The voice spoke again, its tone resolute. "The key and the guardian will lead, but the cycle belongs to all. Balance is a shared burden." A deep sense of understanding washed over me, mingled with a profound sadness. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something far greater than myself, than Ben, than either of us had imagined. The cycle wasn't just a burden. It was a living, breathing force, one that demanded more than one pair of hands to hold it. The figures began to fade, their threads shining brightly as they wove into the nexus. The light grew softer, the roar diminishing to a faint hum. The book descended slowly, its glow dimming as it settled back onto the platform. Ben turned to me, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "We're not alone anymore," he said. "But this is still our path." I nodded, tears slipping down my cheeks. We'll lead them. Together. The nexus pulsed once more, its threads glowing with a steady, reassuring rhythm. The pull that had guided me here was gone, replaced by something deeper. A sense of purpose, of connection. As we stepped away from the platform, the book resting silently in my arms, the nexus began to fade. The threads dimmed, their light retreating into the vast expanse, but their presence remained, a quiet hum in the background of my mind. When the world reformed around us, we were standing in the clearing once more. The frost on the grass sparkled in the moonlight, and the air was crisp and still. I looked at Ben, his hand still in mine, and felt the faint hum of the cycle resonating between us. "It's not over," I said softly. He smiled, a hint of warmth returning to his face. "No," he said. "But we've got this." As we walked away from the clearing, the stars above seemed brighter, their light a reminder of the threads that now connected us to something greater. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time I didn't feel afraid. The key and the guardian. Together we would face whatever came next. And we would hold the balance. The days following our return from the clearing were a strange mix of normalcy and unease. The book rested on the desk in the study, its glow now faint but constant. The diary lay beside it, a reminder of how this all began. Life resumed in the quiet moments, cooking meals, sitting in silence, and trying to grasp the enormity of what had happened. But beneath the surface, the threads of the cycle hummed, a subtle yet persistent reminder that our work was far from over. Ben and I began to notice changes almost immediately. People in our lives, friends, neighbors, even strangers, seemed drawn to us in inexplicable ways. They lingered longer in conversations, their eyes carrying a glimmer of something familiar, as though they could sense the threads connecting them to the cycle. The pull wasn't as strong as it had been for me, but it was there, faint and insistent. One evening, as we sat in the study, I opened the diary again. The notes in the margins, written in Ben's hand, now felt like echoes from another life. I turned to a blank page near the back and froze. New words had appeared, written in the same glowing symbols as the book. The balance shifts. The threads call. I looked up at Ben, my stomach tightening. "It's happening again," I said, my voice trembling. He moved to my side, his eyes scanning the page. "The cycle is reaching out," he said quietly. "It's testing the connections." "What does that mean?" I asked, dread creeping into my chest. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It means the others, the people it's pulling in, they're starting to feel it. They'll need us to guide them." The thought was overwhelming. I had barely come to terms with my own role in the cycle, and now we were expected to lead others? I closed the diary, leaning back in my chair as the weight of it all pressed down on me. "How are we supposed to help them?" I asked. "We barely understand this ourselves." Ben placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch steady and grounding. "We'll figure it out, just like we've figured out everything else." His words were meant to reassure me, but they only deepened my sense of unease. The threads were alive, shifting and growing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. That night I dreamed of the nexus. The threads stretched out before me, glowing and vibrant, weaving together in intricate patterns. I saw the faces of the people it had called, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. I reached out to them, trying to guide them, but the threads shifted, pulling them away from me. A voice echoed in the void, the same voice that had spoken to me in the nexus. "The balance must hold. The cycle depends on unity." I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The room was dark, but the faint hum of the cycle was there, a constant presence at the edge of my mind. Ben stirred beside me, his hand brushing against mine. "You okay?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Just a dream," I said softly. "The nexus." He sat up slightly, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. "What did it show you?" "People," I said, my voice trembling. "The ones it's calling. They were lost, Ben. I couldn't reach them." He was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Then we'll have to find a way to bring them together, to show them the threads." "And if we can't?" I asked, the fear creeping into my voice. He reached for my hand, his grip firm. "We will." The following day, the first person came to us. It was a woman in her early 40s, her face pale and drawn. She knocked on the door, her hands shaking as she introduced herself. "I don't know why I'm here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But something told me I needed to find you." Ben and I exchanged a glance, the gravity of her words sinking in. The threads were calling, just as the book and the diary had said. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let her enter. As she sat at the kitchen table, her story tumbled out in fragments. Strange dreams, an unshakable pull, and a growing sense that her life was no longer her own. She described feelings I knew all too well. The disorientation, the fear, the sense of something far larger than herself. "You're not alone," I told her, my voice steady despite the whirlwind inside me. "You're connected to the cycle, just like we are." "What does that mean?" she asked, her eyes wide. "It means you're part of something bigger," Ben said, sitting beside her. "And we're here to help you understand it." As we spoke, the faint hum of the cycle grew stronger, resonating in the air around us. I felt the threads tighten, binding us to her in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. This was the beginning of something new, a network, a family, a web of connections stretching across the cycle. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. Together, we would hold the balance. Together, we would walk the path. And together, we would face whatever came next. Over the next weeks, the pull of the cycle grew stronger, and more people began to arrive. They came from all walks of life. A quiet teenager with haunted eyes, a retired teacher who trembled as he spoke, a construction worker who sat silently for hours before finally sharing his story. Each one was bound to the cycle, their threads glowing faintly in the nexus of our shared connection. At first, they came hesitantly, unsure of why they were here, or even how they had found us. But as they sat in the study, surrounded by the book, the diary, and the quiet hum of the threads, something changed. Their fear began to shift into understanding, and their confusion gave way to determination. Ben and I did our best to guide them, though we were often as uncertain as they were. The book and the diary continued to change, their messages growing more frequent and insistent. Each night, I pored over their pages, trying to decipher the cryptic symbols and fragmented instructions. One evening, as the group gathered in the living room, the hum of the cycle intensified. The air grew heavy, the threads of the nexus shimmering faintly around us. The book sat on the coffee table, its glow brighter than usual, and the room fell silent as its symbols began to shift. "What's happening?" someone whispered, their voice trembling. Ben stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the book. "It's showing us something," he said, his tone calm but urgent. "Pay attention." The symbols formed a single, clear message. The threads converge. The storm approaches. A murmur rippled through the room, the weight of the words settling over us like a heavy cloud. "What storm?" the retired teacher asked, his voice laced with fear. "What does it mean?" I glanced at Ben, my stomach twisting. "It means something's coming," I said softly. "Something big." The teenager, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Is it something we're supposed to stop?" Ben nodded, his jaw tightening. "If the cycle is warning us, it means we're the ones who have to face it." The group fell into a tense silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The book's glow dimmed slightly, but the hum in the room remained steady, a constant reminder of the connection we shared. That night, I dreamed of the storm. The nexus stretched out before me, its threads rippling with energy. The light was brighter, more chaotic, and the hum had grown into a deafening roar. I saw figures moving through the threads, people like the ones who had come to us, their faces blurred and indistinct. They struggled against the pull of the storm, their threads tangling and fraying as they fought to hold on. And then from the center of the nexus, the storm erupted. It was a swirling mass of shadow and light, a force of pure chaos that consumed everything in its path. The threads snapped one by one, their light extinguished as the storm tore through the nexus. I tried to reach for them, to stop the unraveling, but the force was too strong. It surged toward me, and just before it reached me, I woke up. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Ben stirred beside me, his hand brushing against mine. "Another dream?" he asked, his voice groggy. I nodded, my throat dry. "The storm. It's real, Ben. And it's coming." He sat up, his expression sharpening. Then we need to be ready. The next day we called the group together. They sat in the living room, their faces tense as Ben and I explained what we had seen. The cycle is warning us, I said, the diary open on my lap. The storm is going to test everything we've done, everything we've built. The construction worker crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. And what are we supposed to do about it? We hold the balance, Ben said firmly. That's what the cycle has been preparing us for. The threads are stronger now because of all of you. Together we can stop this. How? The teenager asked, her voice quiet but steady. Ben looked at me, and I could see the same resolve in his eyes that had carried us through everything so far. We follow the threads, he said. We fight the storm just like we've fought everything else. The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over us. The hum of the cycle was louder now, a steady rhythm that resonated in my chest. I looked around at the group, at the faces of the people who had come to us, drawn by a force they couldn't explain. We can do this, I said, my voice steady. We've already come this far. We're stronger together. One by one they nodded, their fear giving way to determination. The threads of the cycle pulsed faintly around us, their light a reminder that we were not alone. The storm was coming, but we would face it together. And we would hold the balance. The storm arrived with no warning, the sky above the house turning dark and turbulent. The air hummed with an energy that set my teeth on edge, and the faint glow of the threads around us flared into brilliance. The group gathered in the living room, the book and diary at the center of our makeshift circle. Everyone's faces were etched with fear, but their eyes burned with determination. We had prepared for this moment, though none of us truly understood what it would entail. The book pulsed with light, its symbols shifting rapidly. Words began to form on its pages, glowing brighter with each passing second. The nexus phrase. The threads weaken. Balance requires sacrifice. I stared at the words, my chest tightening. Sacrifice. I had known deep down that this was coming. The cycle had always demanded more than it gave. What does it mean? The teenager asked, her voice trembling. It means someone has to go, Ben said, his voice quiet but steady. Someone has to hold the storm at bay. The group fell into stunned silence. I looked at Ben, dread pooling in my stomach. No, I said, shaking my head. Not again. He met my gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. Amy, this is what we've been preparing for. The guardian holds the balance. That's my role. Tears welled in my eyes as I stepped toward him. We just got you back. I can't lose you again. You won't, he said softly, taking my hand. I'll still be here. Always. The threads around us pulsed violently, the light growing erratic. The storm was closer now, its presence pressing in on us like a suffocating weight. The book flared, and new words appeared. The guardian protects. The key unlocks. I shook my head, the tears spilling over. There has to be another way. Ben smiled faintly, brushing a tear from my cheek. There isn't. But you'll finish this, Amy. You'll lead them. The group stood frozen, their faces a mix of fear and sorrow. The teenager reached out, her voice breaking. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do, Ben said, his tone firm. The cycle needs a guardian, and I'm ready. The storm surged, the windows rattling as the air filled with the roar of the threads unraveling. Ben stepped toward the center of the room, the light of the nexus swirling around him. I grabbed his arm, desperation clawing at my chest. Ben, please. He turned to me, his eyes soft. You'll lead them, he said. You'll show them the way. Before I could respond, the light enveloped him. The storm reached its peak, the roar deafening, and Ben's form dissolved into the threads. The nexus flared, the threads weaving together in a brilliant display of light and energy. And then silence. The storm was gone. The air grew still, the light of the nexus dimming to a soft glow. The group stood motionless, their faces etched with grief and awe. The book rested on the table, its glow fading to a faint hum. I sank to my knees, my hands trembling. He's gone, I whispered, the words hollow in the silence. But then faintly I heard his voice, soft but steady, carried on the hum of the threads. I'm here. The group turned to me, their eyes filled with expectation. The weight of the cycle pressed down on me, but I straightened, wiping the tears from my face. Ben's sacrifice had given us this moment. This chance to hold the balance. The cycle isn't over, I said, my voice strong despite the ache in my chest. We'll keep it together. For him. For all of us. The threads pulsed faintly, their light a quiet reassurance. The journey wasn't over, but we had taken the first step. Together we would hold the balance.